Hey everybody, two Alpha Gals here. I'm Debbie Nichols.
And I'm Candace Mathis, and you're listening to In the Tall Grass, where we're sharing stories of reinvention, resilience, and rediscovering joy.
Whether it's facing Alpha Gal syndrome or any other redefining chapter of life, we all have to learn how to navigate the journey through the tall grass. So here we go.
So we are super excited for our guest today. It is Michael Rubino, who has become a renowned leader in the mold and remediation space. He is the president of HomeCleanse and author of The Mold Medic, an expert's guide on mold removal. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Michael.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We are so excited to dig into this. Debbie and I talk about mold and just the parallel with all of this and alpha gal syndrome. So we cannot wait to dig into this. So I guess to start us off with, can you share just a little bit about yourself, what brought you into the mold field and how it led to you becoming one of the leading experts in this industry?
Yeah, sure. I was about 2 years old and most people wanted to be, cops or superheroes. And I wanted to be this mold defender, for me, I think my dad's been a contractor my whole life. So I've been around construction and buildings, for as long as I can remember. And then he did what's called fire restoration. So, buildings catch fire. He's rebuilding buildings from the ground up. Lots of VOCs and chemical residues and arsenic and you name it, right, from fires that happen, creating all kinds of air quality elements that, he was forced to deal with. On top of that, fires get put out with water, right? So you typically see some mold exposure there too. And it was really interesting for me growing up and seeing this. And, specifically, he dealt with a lot with insurance companies. Most people, if they have a fire, they're not rebuilding the house on their own. They have insurance and the insurance company steps in and covers the cost. But of course, there's always that challenge between, make it look like it never happened, but not actually scientifically prove that it never happened. And so as I started to kind of see all of this stuff unfold, I started to really see some missing links with the way in which the insurance industry and insurance restoration contractors approach our homes and buildings, and how really they miss the mark on the microbiological side of things, which really relates to how we feel as humans living inside those spaces. Because at the end of the day, mold or bacteria or all these other things like VOCs and formaldehyde, these are tiny particles that are entering our body with each of the 20,000 breaths we take. And human beings are incredibly complex. No two people are exactly alike. And so, we're going to have different genetics and epigenetics and different, pre-existing conditions or tick bites, right? That could change the way our immune system operates, could make our mast cells more active, as an example, where we're literally fighting ourselves inside out. And this is in connection, what I've seen people struggling with these mysterious health issues over the past, almost 11 years now since I've been doing this. And, being able to help people create these safer spaces, these improved air quality, so that they're basically inhaling less particles and toxins. I've seen remarkable transformations. And so, for me, I feel like I'm in this new frontier of trying to build health and wellness from outside in instead of from inside out. Right. And I've seen remarkable transformations and results. And, it feels like I've been doing it forever, but it also feels like I'm just getting started. So it's really exciting.
I'm sure that is exciting, especially as you say, to see these remarkable transformations. And I'm sure that must just spur you on in what you're doing. But was there sort of an inciting incident or something specific that sparked your passion for improving air quality? I know your website mentions that you've helped over 1,000 families heal from toxic mold exposure. That's a big impact that you're having. And I'm curious what it was that sort of sparked that passion for you.
Yeah, I think it really was the first home I ever walked into when I was working for my dad after college and moved back home and the big city, New York City, and going to different places. And the first home I walked into was this home that was, supposedly remediated from Sandy. And when you walked in, you observed like a musty odor, but it looked like totally normal, right? You would have never guessed that place had flooded, and that's because cosmetically they fixed everything. So it truly looked like it never happened. But as you really started to look into the results, and for me, it was just talking to her, and she was explaining all these different ailments. She was having issues walking. She was walking with a cane. She was an older woman, if I had to guess, maybe early 60s. But early 60s, you don't necessarily need a cane unless you have, right, some sort of debilitating issue. For her, I mean, she didn't have anything. She wasn't diagnosed with anything. She just was having trouble walking all of a sudden. She was having vision issues. And, again, like most people would chalk this up to getting older. But she was like, I didn't have these before my home was water damaged. And she was in firm belief that all of the ailments that she was experiencing was a result of the home. And I found this remarkably interesting because to me, I was probably 24 at the time, 23 at the time, something to that effect. To me, at that point in time, I had never thought that, an issue inside of a home could alter your health at all. Here we are, these tiny little organisms that you can't even see getting inside the body and creating an impact. How could that, we're so much bigger than that. How could that create that much of an impact for something so small? But then I started to realize, well, viruses and bacteria, all these things we already know about. Of course, we can get super sick, even die from a virus exposure, right? And so as I started to really unravel this and started to pay more attention, I became highly interested in seeing whatever I can do to help shape the problem that most companies in the remediation industry and most insurance companies just weren't simply aware of. And I think that's where the passion started to come from, is it started to snowball as I saw this pattern of more and more people, especially after this big traumatic hurricane and Hurricane Sandy that happened in the Northeast.
Yeah. And I think that is so important for people to hear, because I think we overlook that a lot of times in our health journey. And I think it is so impactful that as a 24-year-old, like the light bulb kind of went off and you started to go down that road of exploration into the deeper presence of mold and like what that really does to us. And, we can relate so much with all of that in our struggle with alpha-gal syndrome. And I would love to know, was it hard? Were you met with a lot of like conflict with other specialists and remediators around you? Like, how did you break through kind of that stigma? Because I know we've met it. I've had a lot of inspectors and such come into my home that's an older house, and I've heard it firsthand, like, oh, it's fixed. There's nothing there. So how did you kind of break through that as a younger professional to get people to like listen to you?
Well, I don't know that people still listen to me, to be honest. It's the biggest challenge that I have faced my entire career. It's getting other people to see that maybe the way they've been doing things for 20 to 30 years needs to be improved. Maybe, I don't try not to say that people have been doing things the wrong way, because the information 20, 30 years ago, I mean, we didn't have the technology we have today. PCR technology and being able to test the dust, that was pretty recently released, 2015 to 2017. And so, it's before that, I mean, people relied on air tests. Before air tests, people relied on visual inspections, and it's we've all heard the saying, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. When you've been doing something for 20, 30 years and you feel that you're an expert and you feel that, you have done everything correctly and there's no reason to change or adapt, you're not going to do so. And so, a lot of people have said things about me like I'm over the top, or, I've heard conspiracy theories about me, it's just like crazy stuff. Right. But the reality of it is it's people struggling to adapt to new information, to new technology. And so the easiest thing to do is try to discredit me and what I'm trying to do, than to, improve what they're doing themselves. I think that's probably been some of the bigger challenges. I spoke at the Indoor Air Quality Association's conference back in 2020, and I was heckled. These were all industry professionals. I was definitely heckled. What somebody said, so you mean to tell me that if I have mold in my attic, I have to remove all of the insulation? And it's like, yes, you do, right? Because that mold is going to travel in the air and it's going to settle in the insulation. And it will eventually migrate downstairs, right? Because it's going to move. And so, really really trying to break the mold, if you will, and get people to really understand that there's a more thorough approach that's needed when you're dealing with a microbiological contamination. I think for some people that is a tough pill to swallow. And for me, I don't lose sleep over people who don't agree with me. There are so many people that I am helping, and watching those people transform and improve as a result of improving their environment. That's really all the proof that I'll ever need.
We see a lot of that in the tick-borne illness world. Like, I won't even limit it to just alpha-gal syndrome. And so, you brought something up about these challenges. And one of the comments that was on your website that really resonated with me was something you said: one of the greatest challenges of dealing with a contaminated indoor environment is the lack of support and understanding regarding this increasingly prevalent issue. And I think that goes hand in hand, right? And there's so much awareness that's needed when it comes to mold, when it comes to alpha-gal syndrome and other tick-borne illnesses. Can you speak directly to what you're doing to change this?
Well, I'm trying to do a lot of different things. For one, I put out a lot of content, and the reason being is because I want consumers to get educated. If my colleagues, if you will, don't want to change, and I think that change is coming, by the way, because I just saw some new regulations, not regulations, but new standards by the ISCRC that looks like they're heading more in the direction that I've been working in for the last 10 years. But that's good, right? That means that people have to adapt and they're going to be forced to do things more thoroughly. I wrote a book, as you know, and I'm actually in the process of updating that book, re-releasing it under a new title. And the reason being is because I want to, the word mold in general is such an ugly word. And I think it's a scary word. And I think a lot of people automatically write it off like, well, I don't have mold, so I don't have to worry about this. But, when you realize that 80% of homes have a history of water damage based on the largest home survey ever done in 1994 by John Spankler, I mean, 80%, right? You probably do have mold, unfortunately. Sorry to tell you that. So, when you look at that, it's like, well, then maybe we should back off of mold and talk more about, the overall effects this has. Like, we take 20,000 breaths per day, right? Start talking more about how important that is to breathe healthier air. Start to talk more about creating healthier environments, using the positive outliers instead of focusing on the negative connotation that mold might have, and re-releasing the book for a broader population to bring more of that health and wellness community into the mix. I am, desperately trying to make this more of a mainstream issue without that negative connotation so that we can talk amongst ourselves. It's like if I had mold in my house, which, by the way, I did until I remediated it, right? In the probably 5 years ago, if I talked to my neighbor, I would be like scared to say I had mold, right? Because it's like, ooh, he's got mold, But the reality of the situation is your neighbor probably does too, and they don't realize, number one. Number two, it's something that happens, right? It's a naturally occurring phenomenon in our environment. If we don't control it, if we have leaks that we're not aware of, it doesn't mean that you're not a good housekeeper. It means that something happened that you're unaware of, either to you or the previous owner, who knows, right? But we need to be able to talk about these things, I think, and that's really the key. And that's why I'm here on this podcast, right? Because I think creating that awareness around this is okay to talk about, improving our air quality and wanting to create a safer environment for ourselves, for our loved ones. And I think if we make this more widely known and accepted, we're going to see a lot of interesting things, I think, in the health community. Autoimmune disease is on the rise. Chronic fatigue syndrome, something that was discovered in 1986, through this outbreak in Lake Tahoe, which is fascinating, by the way. Went from 176 cases in this one outbreak to 2.5 million people being impacted by this throughout the world today. The things are getting worse, not better. And, for me, I think one of the biggest reasons for that is because, over the past 40 years or so, we still haven't been paying as much attention to air quality. And I think if we start to do that, just like I get to see all of these people feel better inside their homes, we might be able to see that more on a large scale if there's more attention on it. So, my goal is to create as much awareness as possible. I have a nonprofit called Change the Air Foundation, where we literally work on education and policy reform, speaking to government officials to create the awareness politically, because we're going to need government assistance, of course. But it's working tirelessly for this cause that I so desperately believe in.
And it's so appreciated, like seriously, Michael, because as someone with an autoimmune disease and a tick-borne disease, my bucket tipped really easily. And mold was a factor in that. And I think a lot of people in this health journey with chronic illness, whatever it may be, that could be the tipping point, right? I mean, it could be the underlying cause for some people, but it also could be the last straw in a way. I'm grateful that you have such a passion to bring awareness to not only, educate people, but educate, people in legislation to where big change can happen, but working hand in hand with other practitioners, especially like functional medicine. I think that was where I learned about it first. I had never thought about my air quality or my home environment until I saw a functional medical practitioner. And so, testing for mycotoxins and all of that to see if your immune system is in overdrive. And I just want to thank you again for all of the work that you're doing, because it's incredible. I think one thing I would love to know is, what would be your first piece of advice? What is like the first step? Because it can be very, very overwhelming. Even if you learn, like, yes, this is an issue. What is the advice you give someone in taking the first step to find out if their air quality is making them sick?
Well, first off, I appreciate that. And, it's when you work in any field and you work hard and you're always met with opposition. I'm sure Steve Jobs, when he created the first iPod or something, it wasn't easy, and he was met with a lot of opposition of, you can't do that or whatnot. It doesn't matter who you are, what you do. Things are difficult. It's always difficult. If it was easy, everybody would do it, right? That's what they say. So I appreciate that. There's no audience for me. There's no standing ovations. It's just help as many people as I can. And that's that gratitude that I feel is kind of what keeps me going. In respects to like, where do you start? I'm a solution oriented person. And so anytime that I look at a problem, I'm always looking at a solution for that problem. And it's how I created a process around creating healthy environments that went far beyond just mold remediation, right? And when I looked at one of the biggest issues with understanding if my building or home has mold or bacteria or toxins, it's testing for it, right? I mean, a lot of people get these air tests. They call an inspector, they pay them $1,000+. They get an air test. They do 1 or 2 samples as a measure to screen the home, right? And we'll talk more about why that's flawed and why that provides a lot of people a false sense of security. But essentially, you get a lot of these written off as, your home's not the problem, good news. But the data doesn't support, either denying or approving that idea. And that's mainly because when you take an air sample in the center of a room, for example, first off, it's further away than where the problems typically are. I mean, it's very rare that you have a leak in the center of your room. You typically have it on an exterior wall, or a wall that might have plumbing fixtures or plumbing pipes running through it. So, the further away you take a sample, the less likely you are to find something abnormal. And this is all a game of finding things that are abnormal. How abnormal are they? How might that impact the person? And then making improvements from there. And so when you're looking at 2 or 3 air samples, and that's indicative of an entire screen of the home, That'd be like if you went to a doctor and said, I'm not feeling well. And the doctor's like, okay, good. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to check your vitamin D. Guess what? Your vitamin D looks great. You're not sick. Get out of here. Because that is essentially what's happening. We're looking at one minutia and saying like the home is perfect. You're in good shape. That's not going to work. So I had to think about, what is the most effective way of really identifying potential abundance of particles and toxins in our environment. And so we looked at PCR technology. A lot of you may have heard of ERMI as an example, if you're kind of in the mold community and have really done your homework. And there's a big flaw with ERMI that I didn't like so much. And that's basically this scoring algorithm that was developed by the EPA. The scoring algorithm itself was, I guess, meant to be for educational purposes. It was meant to kind of, there was their stab at trying to understand if there's a way to score homes. And we found out that it didn't work really well, and mainly because it just subtracts the amount of water damage molds from the amount of outdoor molds that you might commonly find outside. Well, the issue is if I open a window, I can have all the water damage molds in the world. But if I just allow enough outdoor molds to come in, guess what? I'm going to have a great score, but my home might still be a problem. And so what I wanted to do is that made ERMI's use pretty limited, meaning a consumer really couldn't get an ERMI on their own and then actually take that data and do something with it, right? And so that was the biggest challenge that I wanted to solve. And I created this product called the dust test. And what the dust test does is it takes away the score. There's no more score. It is data. And every time someone buys a dust test, it comes with a free consultation to explain what that data means so that people can then take that information and then do what they need to do with it. For example, maybe you might want to say, okay, I see a problem here. I'm going to need to get a mold inspection. Okay, well, then now you have the information to be able to take to your inspector and say, look, what I need to do here is I need you to help me find where these problems are coming from. Before, right, we would call a mold inspector first, and then the mold inspector would take these samples and say, guess what? Good news, no problem here. And so now you're in control because you're saying, no, I don't need you to tell me if there's a problem. I know there's a problem. Here's the results. Now I need you to help me find where these 3 species that are off the charts are coming from, because they have to be coming from somewhere. And, of course, there's all this controversy around that too, because nobody can ever agree on anything. But, the reality of it is when people utilize this approach, they're finding these issues. Another remarkable thing is if we're seeing, let's say someone has really high levels of aspergillus, right? And then they take medical labs and maybe they have, biomarkers that show they've been exposed to aspergillus, which creates ochratoxin A. Maybe they have high levels of ochratoxin A in their body. You're seeing this correlation between the health in the home due to the advancements in technology that you've really never been able to address before. And so for me, I think like we're really breaking ground here on not only understanding how important air quality is, but tools and technologies that we can actually take and put into action and create safer spaces for people individually. And I think that's really where this is headed.
Sounds like you're starting at the ground level. And I think that's fantastic. It gives people a jumping off point, which I don't think we've necessarily have. So that's great what you're doing. Can we take a step back for just a second? And can you talk to us about how mold permeates our home environment? You mentioned it a little bit in the beginning, talking about your dad doing fire restoration and the water coming in, but can you give us a little more detail on that?
Yeah. So when we look at like mold and bacteria, which are pretty much the 2 biggest concerns when you have water damage, well, they start off as a seed, right? Like a spore, as is called in mold, similar to if you look at a flower or a plant, how that produces seeds. And just like that same concept, the seed then gets met with water, in this case in the soil, and it grows into a new plant, flower, et cetera, right? Mold produces pretty similarly. It produces spores. It's their version of seeds, just to kind of draw the analogy here. And those spores, when met with water, and it has the ability to grow, and it doesn't need soil, it can just grow right into the building materials, unfortunately, it will do so. And once it does that, it goes from a spore to a living organism, just like how a seed isn't alive yet until it becomes fully a plant. And then once it's a plant, it's really alive. And so same with mold. And as it's alive, it can produce toxins if it feels threatened. We don't really understand all the ways that mold makes mold feel threatened, or all the different ways when it just decides to produce mycotoxins, but it can and it does. And then it constantly is reproducing. Most organisms on this planet, they have this urge to survive, and they're constantly reproducing. Mold's no different. And it grows and colonizes, meaning they all grow together. These spores, they land, they grow, and then they reproduce, and they land and they grow, and it just becomes this massive colony, almost like an ant colony, right, inside your wall cavities. And where that really becomes a problem is it starts to grow, and it starts to produce more and more. As it produces more and more, it's going to travel more and more. Then it gets into our HVAC systems. Most modern HVAC systems don't have good filtration. So unfortunately, they're going to get into the HVAC system. The HVAC system constantly condensates. So it's another wet environment where mold can grow. Now it starts to grow in the HVAC system, right? Now it starts to spread throughout the home. And so it just snowballs until it gets out of control. And here we are, innocent human beings trying to live our lives. And, we just get annihilated by the amount of particles and toxins we're breathing. You probably have already heard this, but we already live in a toxic world with all the toxins that we experience on a daily basis. So adding more into the mix, impacting the air that we're breathing, it can really cause some issues.
Yeah. And I have to say firsthand, so when I found your information in your Instagram page, I almost fell out when I read a post of yours that was talking about mold in the rim of your toilet. And I was like, what? And so lo and behold, it started happening in my bathroom. And I did exactly what you said. It's like, okay, something's happening in this bathroom to make this happen, because I was cleaning, my bathroom regularly. And we had a small leak underneath our sink in our bathroom that I did not see. And it was like way in the back, on the shelving, like way in the back. And once I took care of that, it remedied itself. But I was really fascinated by that. So can you explain kind of how, like, what the indicators could be? I guess maybe seeing them and then maybe not seeing them. Like, are there indicators for each scenario?
Yeah, I mean, there are many indicators, but unfortunately, sometimes the indicators don't show up. And so that can make things a little bit trickier, because you might have hidden problems behind a wall or behind a ceiling that you just don't know about. This is especially true in like bathrooms where there's tile covering it, or kitchen cabinets covering up a problem. Is, as you noticed, there was a cabinet in your bathroom that was leaking and you had no idea. It tends to grow in these random places that we often neglect, because most of us will realize a pretty, significant link to show up in some of these signs. But, what was really interesting about the whole toilet trick is I review a lot of laboratory data daily, almost 10 times a day. And, it was really interesting to me is I kept saying like, this person has a mold problem. Okay. This person has a mold problem. Interesting. This person has a mold problem. What do they all have in common? All of them have like severely high levels of mold growing in their toilet tanks. And I was like, this is odd. I mean, and it got to the point where it was like literally 90% of the reports that I'm reading have mold in their toilet tanks. And so I'm like, well, I guess what's really happening is opportunistically, mold just travels through the air. It is going to grow wherever it lands. Now, the toilet tank is pretty interesting because, most of us, they have this heavy cover on it. You're not getting a ton of air exchange. So what I found is that when you have lower levels of mold, you don't really see mold in the toilet tank. But when you have an abundance of mold, you see it growing in the toilet tank. And it's just because it's the opportunity that it just happens to be so much so in the air that one or two spores get in and they start to have a party inside your toilet tank. And I just found this really interesting. And so I said, you know what, guys, start checking your toilet tanks, because every time I see a problem with a mold issue, there's mold nearby. It's in the bathroom. It's in the HVAC. It is somewhere that is just getting too much too fast. And so that was kind of what was born out of this toilet tank hack that, again, was poo-pooed for by certain scientific communities. But we then get to some of the other signs that you want to look for. It's the obvious, these coffee-like stains that you see. As water travels through our home and building, it can pick up rust from a nail. It can pick up different sediments, dust, things like that. And you'll see this discoloration happen from the water picking those things up and then bringing them into our wall structure or our ceiling structure. And so that's a pretty obvious sign. Hey, there's issues there. We might want to address that. Mold can grow in as quickly as 24 to 48 hours. So it's not like it needs to happen for weeks at a time. It can happen pretty quickly. So if you see water, do something about it faster, and you'll have less of a problem than if you just let it go for weeks or months on end. Obviously, musty odors, that's pretty prominent with, having an issue. The whole damp basement smell, that is not normal. Basements should not smell damp and musty. I know we all think they should, just because all of us have grown up in having some sort of damp, musty environment. But the reality of it is that was always indicative of a problem that we found, that we thought as a society was just normal. It is not. With dehumidification, with proper waterproofing, you can definitely make a basement smell clean like it should be, like the rest of our house. So musty odors, which sometimes people report them as like cigar-like smells or very earthy smells. So it depends on your particular sense of smell and how it shows up for you. But all three of those kind of usually are indicative of the same thing. And then I think, if you see buckling or crackling paint or separation between two surfaces, like your baseboard separating from your wall or your ceiling molding separating from your ceiling, those are usually some signs that something's going on there and you may want to check it out.
Okay, that is so helpful. Let's say, hypothetically, one of our listeners is in the very small percentage of homes that has zero mold problems. It smells great. There's no indication of mold presence. What are some steps that said listener could take to prevent mold from becoming an issue?
Yeah, I think that is really important. If we want to create a healthy environment, it's got to be long lasting. Creating a healthy environment typically requires some sort of undertaking of a renovation. As you mentioned earlier, you had to, deal with your sink, and I'm not sure if you replace your cabinet or not, but there's some sort of technical construction element that has to happen into this equation. And so one of the biggest important things is, if you're going to spend money investing into the air quality of your home, you want to make sure that these problems that allowed it to exist in the first place don't just allow this problem to come back a year later. And so a couple of different things for showers. Unfortunately, I have to rip out a lot of showers all across the country because they're not built properly with proper waterproofing. So grout is semi-porous. Water and moisture does seep through the grout. And if it gets behind the tile and starts intruding into the wall cavity, lo and behold, there will be an issue. And so waterproofing your showers properly is really important. And waterproofing is not just like green drywall, the moisture resistant stuff that you get at Home Depot or something. That is not waterproofing. No, waterproofing consists of an actual waterproofing membrane. It's typically like fiberglass or some sort of rubberized product that keeps the water from getting into the wall cavity and typically ties into the drain. So that is really important. Dehumidification strategies, really important, especially in warmer, more humid climates, of course. Keeping humidity around 45 to 50% is ideal. Once you start getting above 60%, you're really in that danger zone where mold can start to grow. And as you remember, it only takes 24 to 48 hours to grow. So, you want to really control humidity all the time. On the flip side, if you live in a drier climate, like let's say Arizona, adding too much humidity, right, allowing that humidity to creep up above 60% is not good either. So keep that in mind. If you literally see condensation developing on your walls, you're adding too much moisture and you need to dial it back, or you're going to have some mold issues. Making sure that the house is not leaking is really key. So having some annual inspections to add to your list is probably a good idea. A couple $100 to each person might save you a couple thousands or tens of thousands later. So keep that in mind. You want to check your roof. You want to check doors and windows. Doors and windows will leak over time. Roofs will leak over time. Pay special attention to where some of the weak spots on roofs, which is going to be around like vent pipe stacks. Any pipes that protrude from the roof, they typically have like a rubber boot that goes around it to prevent water from getting in. Those break down over time. Sun, rain, etc. You also have like valleys, right, where two roof sections meet each other, or where you might have, different roof elevations where one roof's slightly lower than the other. And so where roof structures and wall structures meet, kind of forming this little valley here, that's going to be a weak spot too. And those typically have flashing that does need to be maintained as well. So, having people out to your home to check these types of things is really important, because as human beings, we typically wait till they break and then fix it. And if we're more proactive, we're going to save a lot more money in home maintenance over time.
Great advice.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, because as you're talking, I'm texting my husband and I'm like, we're moving. We're moving out of our 1968 house. I mean, I love it, but like we have original windows, and we've seen kind of that mold that can like grow and all of that. Now, so this is my question. There are probably hundreds of species of mold, I'm guessing. I have no idea. You can tell me. So how many species?
At least 100,000 that we know of.
Oh, I was off by orders of magnitude. That's great. Okay. So out of all of those species, are they all dangerous to us?
Good question. I think we don't really know the answer to that question, truthfully, but there definitely are molds that are more dangerous than others. I'll give you an example. Arobasidium pullans is a type of mold that typically grows in HVACs. I see it in every home. The lowest level I really ever see it is like 2,500 spores per milligram of dust. Now, if we take that 2,500 spores and milligrams of dust and we change it to Stachybotrys, right? Mm-hmm. That is catastrophic, right? So clearly our bodies react much more dangerously to Stachybotrys than Arobasidium. But the reality of it is, I think when it comes down to mold or bacteria or really anything, and I'll give you an example, too much of it is not a good thing, right? We've heard that saying, too much of anything will kill you. Well, dust, we breathe in dust all the time. But if I go outside and there's a dust storm and I inhale tons of dust very quickly, guess what? I'm not going to feel so good. It doesn't mean that dust is necessarily harmful because we breathe in it all the time, but at that level, right, I'm going to feel horrible. I might get really sick. I might have a lung infection. Who knows? The reality of the situation is the same for anything else, including mold. We're going to have normal amounts of mold that we breathe in all the time. So we don't want to be fearful of it, but we want it under control, right? So just like if our blood sugar was out of whack, we want to, control it. Well, we want to control mold from growing in our homes too. We don't want it to get out of whack. We don't want things to become too much that our body then has to fight to remove every time we take a breath, 20,000 times a day.
I love that you're reframing. I can hear it as you're talking, how you're trying to put this in a positive way, in the ways that it can be, so that people can learn to be aware of this topic of conversation rather than live in fear of it. So thank you for doing that too. That's a big part of what we're always trying to do, right? Because ticks and tick-borne diseases can be a very scary thing. So reframing is a huge part of what we're trying to do. And it makes it so much easier to get the word out. So I think I can probably speak for Candace when I say we really appreciate the approach that you're taking in sharing this information. And I would love to know what your future goals are for HomeCleanse. And as you're telling us, please be sure to tell people how they can find out more about your services.
Well, the future plans are almost infinite. The amount of ideas that I have all the time, I write things down and then I wonder if I ever get back to certain things because other ideas come to shape. But there's a couple of things I'd like to accomplish. One, I'd like to accomplish partnering with a manufacturer that can create an air quality monitoring device, similar to how we have ADT or other systems where we lock our doors at night and put our alarm on. And if somebody's breaking in, if we're home, it's waking us up with this crazy loud alarm. But if we're not home, it's notifying us and they're calling the police for us and doing all these things. That is awesome, right? Because now we have that safety, that security that we need. But we don't have that same level of safety and security that we really want for air quality, especially for those that have been down this road, who might have, addressed their home, might have made improvements. These improvements might have been costly. And you want to make sure you want to have that sense of security that, your home is going to not go backwards. And you can accomplish that by buying like a dust test and testing your home every 6 months or every year, whatever frequency you're comfortable with. But that's not enough, because a lot can happen in 6 months or a lot can happen in a year. And something to be able to monitor the air quality in real time would be key. Now, the technology is not there yet, right? Because I don't want to just look at particles. I want to look at specific particles. I want to be able to analyze what that particle is and what that particle particularly means. And then, of course, trying to have some sort of quantification to understand if it's normal or abnormal. And I don't believe we're there technologically yet, but I think that we could pave the way for that in the nearby future, especially as air quality becomes a more prominent awareness where people want to invest in that space. It is a growing industry, so that is on our side. But that is what I see as kind of like the next endeavor to help people really, stay in control. As you mentioned earlier, my goal is not to create fear. I'm not here to divide. I'm not here to create fear in order to sell you something. I'm here to empower you, right? So that you are now educated to make these proper decisions, to take control over your environment and not be fearful of it. And I think that is really important, because, to me, it doesn't matter if you hire me, if you hire somebody else. What matters to me is that you now know who you can hire and who you can't. And, really making sure that you're getting the services you're looking for and not just getting sold some sort of dream that might not work. And I think for me, that is really the biggest importance here.
That's incredible. I mean, honestly, I love that you're empowering people. I love that you have this vision of expansion and, expansion in a way of our minds and understanding the depth of this. And I think that's what resonates so much with me of my own personal health journey and what you're doing for raising awareness about a piece of people's health journey, like a very important piece that I think is overlooked because of either old information, misinformation. We're dealing with there's a lot of parallels with tick-borne diseases where, the research is it's on the verge, right? It just hasn't gotten there yet. So thank you for all that you're doing. We are truly appreciative and cannot wait to see what the future holds. And we hope that we can talk to you again. And I have one more question. So people say this is the hardest question of the whole interview. So what song in this moment or for all time brings you joy?
Wow. That is a very challenging question. What song?
You can give us an artist or an album if that makes it easier.
That might make it easier. Wow, there's so many good songs and albums and artists. I feel like I'm going to do somebody a disservice. I think for me, it's probably Frank Sinatra. And, the very specific reason is I come from this very, Italian-American background, raised in the New York City area. And so, holiday time, there's always Frank Sinatra blaring in the background. And it just always makes me feel like I'm home with where I'm supposed to be with family and loved ones around. And so that's kind of the memories that come forth whenever I hear anything from Frank Sinatra. And so, plus I don't think you can hate that guy. I mean, his music it's for everybody.
It just makes you want to sway, when you hear
it. It just does.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that with us and your reason for it too. That's been really fun to have this conversation with people. We here at Two Alpha Gals talk all the time about joy, and music is one of those things that doesn't cause any kind of allergic reaction. So it's been really fun hearing how it's had an impact on other people. So thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you for being here with us today. This has been a really great conversation, and we really do appreciate everything that you're doing and how you're going about doing it. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us today and to share some of your wisdom with us and our audience.
Absolutely. And honestly, thank you for providing this platform for me to come on and talk about these things. I've helped a lot of people with tick-borne infections, over my career. And it's really interesting to see how, almost everyone with a tick-borne illness has a sensitivity to mold, and specifically water damaged buildings and all that comes with it. I couldn't tell you why or how. I'm not a doctor, but I find it really interesting that, when you have these massive changes in your body, you suddenly become way more sensitive to your environment. And so, if you're out there listening to this, I feel you, I hear you, I know the struggle. I've never personally experienced it. I can only imagine that side of things, but I have worked with so many people in your position, and it is so difficult because you go from doctor to doctor looking for answers. You're probably misdiagnosed dozens of times before someone finally realizes, hey, check for a tick-borne illness. And so you're already, going through so much. And I just hope that, you're able to find some relief by looking at some strategies to improve your air quality, because I know it can help change things dramatically.
It's beautiful. Thank you for that. And where can people find you, Michael?
Yeah, so the website is themichaelrubino.com. Sorry, Michael Rubino was already taken, and it had a play on words from the Mold Medic, which I was previously branding as. And then we have HomeCleanse.com if you're in need of this service to create a healthy environment. The place is great to help you. And then we have ChangeTheAirFoundation.org if you are inspired by the overarching change that I'm working on with the foundation. Give it a look. Every donation helps, but also just being able to share the organization and, volunteering some of your time to maybe help with some of the legislation in your state could be very impactful too. So just really appreciate anybody who cares about the work that I'm doing and wants to help push it forward.
Thank you so much, Michael. We look forward to the next conversation.
Absolutely. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for joining us today on In the Tall Grass. Visit us at 2alphagals.com. That's TWOalphagals.com. Or you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at 2alphagals. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a review and help us grow this community.
We're all faced with obstacles on our journey, whether it be food allergies or tick-borne diseases. You might outgrow the reactions, but you won't outgrow the person you become. Ticks suck, but life doesn't have to.